Welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 30. Joining me today is the author of 3 Ways to Disappear, an excellent novel of tiger conservation and a family that needs healing. This book won the Siskiyou Prize for New Environmental Literature. Hello, Katy Yocom.
Hello, Charlie. I'm so happy to be here.
How are you?
I'm doing very well this morning. We've just inaugurated a new president here in the States, and I'm very, very excited about that.
It's going to be good to see where it goes.
Absolutely.
I'm going to start with your work that isn't writing. You graduated with an MFA from Spalding University and you now work there. Can you tell us about what you do?
Absolutely, yes. It's a low residency MFA program, which means that we meet at the beginning of each semester for only about 8 days, but it's a very intensive, we call it literary boot camp. And then we spend the rest of the semester, each student working individually with a faculty mentor in an independent study from home. It's a really interesting way to study writing. You learn how to write in the midst of your life. You know, you're not kind of isolated in the ivory tower. And when I graduated from the program, I realized I didn't want to leave behind that community, that environment. I wanted to stay really in the thick of it. So I managed to get a job on staff there, and I'm now associate director of the program. I'm deeply involved in working with the alums, as well as communications and other aspects of the program. And it's pretty wonderful to have a working life that keeps me involved with writers every day.
Well, yeah, that sounds lovely, and I like the setup there. It sounds very independent working, pushing you forward.
It is, and I think it's a way to learn writing in which your talents, your ability, your craft kind of leap forward quickly because of all the individual work that you're doing one-on-one with a mentor.
Mm-hmm. Beyond your novel, you have written other fiction and things that have been published. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, yes. Actually, most of my publications beyond the novel have been in the area of nonfiction, and I've had essays published here and there, that quite a few of them available on the web. I've had, 1 or 2 short stories published, but really my energies in terms of fiction, I poured them into the novel for a very long time. The essays that I write tend to come much more quickly and easily for me. My background is in journalism, and I think perhaps that's why. It's a form that comes to me very naturally, and the fiction comes from a different place. Sometimes I've had to take myself away on writing retreats, which is actually quite wonderful, and give it a different sort of space in my head.
Mm-hmm. Well, this sounds really good, and I have to ask, do you think in your future you might write a full book of nonfiction?
I wouldn't be surprised if I do. As I say, the essay form really lends itself to, I think, my natural tendencies. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's one of those in my future. I certainly hope that there will be more fiction as well. That's my plan. But yeah, both of those forms really, really appeal.
Excellent. Listeners, I will drop some links to Katy's work online for you. I think we'd better introduce the book. 3 Ways to Disappear follows 2 American siblings, Quinn and Sarah, who spent their formative years in India. Sarah had a twin, Marcus, who died, and this is the event that ended their stay. Years later, Quinn is married with children, twins of her own, and Sarah is a journalist who works all over the world covering dangerous events. They and their mother are still deeply affected by what happens, and when Sarah decides she's going back to India, changing careers to help with tiger conservation, the wombs and everything they've got to think about start to reopen, as well as, of course, Sarah's journey to the conservation. Katy, you have a reading from the opening for us.
Absolutely, yes. First chapter of the book, and it's from Quinn's perspective. In the year after Marcus died, their mother stopped loving people, one after another. Her minister, her tennis coach, her friends, Daddy. On a day dripping with the end of the monsoon, she clicked shut the brass latches on her daughter's suitcases and supervised as Ravindra loaded them into the car. In the courtyard, beneath the peepal tree, Daddy clutched the girls to his chest. Quinn, at 11, was the responsible one. Sarah, at 8, the remnant twin, widowed by Marcus when he died, if widowed was the word for it, which it wasn't. There was no word for it. Thin mud soaked their shoes as he kissed their cheeks and begged them not to forget him. It was a terrible thing to hear him say, because it opened up the possibility that they could. His voice had gone high with pain, which embarrassed Quinn for him. She didn't think men were supposed to feel that much. Mother pulled the girls away, leaving their father to stand alone in the filtered sunlight, arms dangling at his sides as if he didn't know how they operated. Daddy was a doctor, the reason they lived in India. And India, according to Mother, was the reason Marcus was dead. Daddy's mouth curled down and he cried silently as his daughters watched. Behind them, Aya wept, rhythmic and soft, like singing. Beyond Aya, the watchman stood, the courtyard a chessboard, the adults the game pieces, isolated in their separate squares. Aya's weeping turned ragged, and Quinn and Sarah ran and clung to her until Mother pried their fingers from Aya's damp turquoise sari and pushed the girls, stumbling and crying, into the car. Their shoes muddied the floor mats, but Quinn didn't care. Ravindra opened the wrought iron gate and nosed the car into the inchoate, horn-honking flow of Delhi traffic. In the back seat, Quinn turned around and watched their home grow smaller. Before it vanished altogether, she raised her hand to it and said goodbye. Goodbye to Daddy, to Aya, to every friend, enemy, household staff member, shopkeeper, school teacher, gymnastics instructor, swimming coach. It seemed easy for Mother. She had shut down her heart. But she still loved her girls. The proof was that she took them with her. The other proof was that she hadn't believed Quinn when she tried to confess her role in what had happened to Marcus. Quinn said the words, but Mother had let them fall to her bedroom floor, where they scuttled under the bed and vanished, which meant that the secret was still Quinn's to carry. She had spent a long time considering the consequences before she told Mother what she'd done, but this possibility had never occurred to her. Remember, young ladies, always be good, Ravindra said at the airport curb, his eyes streaming. Sarah and Quinn hugged him hard. They cried, but when Mother told them to leave him, they left, dutiful girls. They boarded an enormous jet and flew west across India, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, across all of Europe to Paris, over the ultramarine Atlantic Ocean and down the eastern seaboard to New York. From there to Louisville, Kentucky, the town where Mother had grown up. They were leaving their unhappiness as far behind them as the planet would allow. Quinn thought she felt it happen. When the plane lifted off from the Delhi runway, she felt an invisible force push her body back into the seat and flow through her, a tide running in the direction of India and the ground. So Mother was right. It was possible to leave things behind, events and stories and history. With a sense of relief as the plane shuddered around her, she lifted up her secret and offered it to the tide. She would go to America, and she would be free. She was 28 years old on the day she stopped believing in this magic. 28 and bare-bellied on an examining table, her husband's fingers interlaced with her own. The ultrasound tech ran a wand over her midsection, and in a haze of black and gray, the two children inside her revealed their identities, a boy and a girl, just like Marcus and Sarah. Sarah was 25 at the time. Marcus was still 7, if he was anything at all. As she looked at the hazy images of the children inside her, she felt it again, the weight of the plane lifting off and pushing her down. And she knew then that distance and years were nothing, that no matter what their mother said, their histories traveled with them, stitched into their DNA.
So, tell us about the starting point for this book.
This book began in a surprising way. I fell in love with a litter of tiger cubs that had been born at the Louisville Zoo in the town where I live. I had been a fan of big cats when I was a little girl. I grew up on the movie Born Free, which is about lions in Africa. And I thought that I had outgrown this crazy kind of obsession I had with big cats until this litter of cubs was born at the zoo. For reasons I really can't explain, I became fascinated with them. I started going to the zoo every week to watch them grow up. They were adorable. They were so much fun to watch. And at first, I had no idea that this was going to lead to a writing project. I thought I was just indulging this sort of childhood love. But I had just graduated from the MFA program. I had completed the project that I was working on in the program, and I didn't have a writing project at the time. And it felt inevitable that the two would come together, this crazy love I developed and the desire to write something. but I didn't know how for a very long time. I thought, first of all, I thought, you can't write a novel about tigers. I thought if anyone wrote a novel about tigers, surely it would be a children's book. And then Life of Pi came out, and I thought, well, there you go. The novel about tigers has already been written, so it can't be done again. But at some level, I think I was withholding permission from myself. And one day I had a conversation with a friend of mine. She had actually been a mentor of mine in the Spalding MFA in writing program. And she gave me permission. She said, Katy, you actually can write a novel about tigers. And the very next day, I think it was, I was out on my deck in the backyard, and I was potting some impatiens in a planter. And I heard a sentence in my head. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's nice. And then I heard another sentence in my head. And I realized that a story was coming to me. And so I put down my gardening trowel and I raced inside and I started typing. And I wrote for probably an hour or so. And that was the very beginning of the novel. It really began so completely focused on the tigers. The human story really came later. I knew at the beginning that there was a woman who traveled from America to India and was working in tiger conservation, and I knew that the story would follow her. But the family story, which really I think is the meat of the book, it was a long time coming. It was a long time developing. First, I gave her a sister, and then I gave them, a family of origin story, and I discovered that her brother had died and that her parents' marriage had come apart. All of this developed very slowly over time. The tiger part of the novel was absolutely the first out of the gate, and it was where all the energy was at first. I wrote this novel over a very long period. It took me close to 10 years, more than 10 years, to write it. I think the benefit of spending such a long time to write the novel was it really had time to cook. And it really had time for the characters to introduce themselves to me and for me to get to know them so deeply that I knew who they were and what they would do, how they would respond in certain situations. I think ultimately the long time frame was good for the book.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you got that kind of push that you needed to write the book. But something you said there is actually something I'd been thinking. I love Quinn. I do love Quinn. And I like how that narrative unfolds. I think it's very good and it raises some very important issues. But I had wondered if you could have maybe told the book without Quinn. And I think you've kind of suggested there maybe, that you had Sarah's narrative on its own beforehand.
I did. And I decided that in writing the book without Quinn, I was creating Sarah as a character who really only had a present. And the more I wrote, the more I realized I really needed her to have a past as well. I had known, in my own imagination, I had known that she grew up in India and had lived there as a child, but I hadn't fleshed it out. And I realized that that really needed to be part of the story. And so I did.
Mm-hmm. Is there anywhere here where the mythical kind of aspects to the book come in?
I think it influenced it. A lot of the more mythical parts of things came out of my research about the beliefs in India about tigers. They are really woven into Hindu mythology to start with. The goddess Durga rides a tiger, for example. And in different parts of India, there are tiger myths and tiger gods that are worshipped across different religions. In the Sundarbans, particularly, where tigers are an existential threat every day to the people who live there, it's maybe not too surprising. But there are a lot of wonderful myths surrounding tigers that I learned about in my research. The idea that there are creatures such as were-tigers that are tigers that can morph into humans and back again. And I did, as you sort of hinted, I did write a little bit of that into the book. It was just too delicious to leave out.
Well, that bit itself, when you're reading it, you're like, oh, I want to know more about this and I want to know how real it is in the context of your work, the magical realism. But I like how you were very subtle with it. It makes the reader delve into it more and leaves a lot to the imagination as well, which is nice.
Yeah, well, thank you. I really think that in a certain sense, we each create our own reality and we have stories that we tell ourselves. I love the room for imagination, the room for creativity, the room for possibilities that we might consider fantastical or magical, but given another context, given another culture, given another way of growing up, might seem perfectly within the realm of reason. If we stop and really look at our own beliefs, we might think that we don't walk around with magical ideas, but I imagine if we started digging into it, we all really do, one way or another.
Well, we've gone down this road of the tigers and the symbolism and everything. Of course, we kind of have to cycle back round to your research trip. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I began writing the novel in 2005. I had the tigers at the zoo led to this idea that I had a novel to write, which led to a lot of research in terms of books and so forth, reading all sorts of natural histories and books about the tiger in India and elsewhere in the world. I got about 50 pages in, and I realized that I couldn't really bring that world to life based on the knowledge that I had gained just from, reading the books and doing that sort of research. In the parts of the book that are set in India, almost every sentence posed a question for me. What would that look like? What would Sarah's apartment look like? What does it look like when she's in the park looking for tigers? What do the lives of the people there look like? And how does the presence of tigers in their midst affect them? And so I realized I really needed to go to India and be there myself and immerse myself in that setting and meet some people, talk to some people, interview some people. This was a little bit of the journalistic side of me kicking out. I love that part of research, sometimes called immersion journalism or body research. But the idea of going to a place, being there, eating the food, smelling the scents in the air, and soaking it all up viscerally and having all sorts of experiences. And I was really lucky because when I realized I needed to go to India to do this research, first of all, I talked it over with my spouse, and he was all for it, which, thank you to him for that. I was trying to figure out how to create this trip, and I came across a wonderful organization. They were called Tiger Trails, and they put together trips for people who wanted to do ecotourism in India looking for tigers. I don't think they operate under that name still, but I believe they are still out there as wildlife trails. At any rate, I started from having absolutely no idea how to put together a trip to go to India and look for tigers, to being fortunate enough to come into contact with people who knew exactly how to do that. And they also performed the miraculous gift of hooking me up with Vipul Jain, who was my naturalist, my guide at Ranthambore. And he showed me not only the park and the tigers, which in my mind was, 95% of the reason I was there, but he also really took care to take me to villages and introduce me to people who lived there so I could get a feel for the lives of people who live literally in close proximity with tigers and who sometimes are competing with them for resources. So here I was on this trip, and I was visiting villages and having talks with people who live there. And I was doing other things. He took me to visit a hospital, for example, and much later the hospital ends up in the book, plays a little role in a development that happens there. He took me to visit an artist who runs an art school, and he took me to visit a wildlife veterinarian who sometimes performed autopsies on tigers who'd been found dead in the park. All of these experiences, all of the people that I talked to, all of the things that I saw ended up in the book in ways I could not have imagined when I was there on the ground, actually having these experiences. In fact, I feel kind of silly saying this now, but at the time I thought, why are we doing this? Why are we going to this hospital? Why are we going to places other than just driving around in a Jeep in the park looking for tigers? And as I say, we did a lot of that, and it was fantastic. But it was these other experiences that he gave me that created kind of a foundation for so much of the story to be built on. Parts of the story that I had no idea would exist until I went there, until I saw life in and around the park and the villages there.
That's fabulous. And it's actually kind of answered a question I had when I started the book. I watch Bollywood films, I speak some Hindi, and I read the book and I started thinking, she's done a lot of research, she knows Hindi. I think your research trip has shown just how much you did take away with you, which is wonderful.
The wonderful thing about traveling is I think, we become sponges and we retain so much. We absorb so much and retain so much, and it can play on our imaginations and come out in ways that you never expect. And as far as me knowing Hindi, I did a little bit of a language lesson app before I went. I learned a few words here and there, but a lot of the individual words that came up were words that I would just hear while I was there and came up over and over. And so it was nice because it gave me the opportunity not to just drop random Hindi words into the book, but to choose the ones that actually fit the context and words that I heard every day when I was there.
No, it was very well done.
Thank you.
So I kind of want to stick on this subject of India, and obviously we've got the tigers as well. How many tigers roughly are we talking about in the place that you travelled to? How well are they doing?
Well, let's see. When I was there, actually, there were, I think, about 3,000 wild tigers in the entire world, which is not a good number. A century ago, the statistic that you hear quoted a lot is that at the beginning of the 20th century, there were 100,000 tigers roaming the world, and that they were decimated. They were absolutely decimated, not only since the beginning of the 20th century, but they were hunted nearly to extinction and driven out, not just hunted, but driven out of their homes as populations expanded and so forth. So at the time I was there were only about 3,000 tigers in the world, wild tigers. There are about 4,000 tigers in the world now, thanks to a global initiative that's really pouring resources into expanding the population of tigers, which is a wonderful initiative. But a greater population of tigers cannot thrive if there's not enough land, enough prey, and enough corridors for dispersal for them to actually live their lives. So what's happening right now is that there are really too many tigers in India, at any rate, for the space allotted to them. And what you're seeing is a lot more human-tiger conflict, which might mean that tigers are increasingly coming into human territory, killing their livestock, killing humans sometimes. That was not happening when I was there in 2006. And now here we are 14 years later, and it's a much bigger problem.
Well, you mentioned the 4,000 there, and your acknowledgements in your author's note were so amazingly detailed. It was really good to see. As a reader, as I was reading that bit, thinking, oh wow, there's 4,000 now, that's really excellent. And then of course you bring in the fact that there's got to be balance, a life balance.
It does. And, that's something that came home to me so clearly in the course of my travels there, that you simply can't say, all right, we're prioritizing the tigers, and too bad to the people who are directly affected by it. Now, the people who are most directly affected by tigers tend to be people who live in poverty, people who don't have much education. So yes, you can try to run roughshod over them if you have the resources and the power, but it's not going to work. People will do what they need to do to survive, and that has to be respected. And people who are living on the margins like that, and whose homes and whose property and whose livestock are literally on the margins of tiger territory, they have to be taken into consideration, and they also have to be part of the solutions that are developed, because they, more than anyone else, really understand what the problems are. For instance, if you are a villager who's, let's say your water buffalo has been killed by a tiger, you might feel very well within your rights to set out some poison so that it doesn't happen to your other animals that you own. So it's complicated, and I think that's really part of what drew me to the topic and to write about it in my book, because one of the reasons we write, and one of the reasons we read, is to wrestle with questions that don't have any obvious answers. And I love to do that. I love to do that as a writer. I love to do it as a reader. And it seems important to me to ask ourselves questions that we can't answer, but that we must try to answer whether or not there's really any hope of finding one obvious right answer or solution.
Mm-hmm. Well, we haven't drifted off track, and yet at the same time, we've kind of got to get back to your book proper. I think this is a good time to go to your second reading.
Okay, great. So this second reading takes place on one of Sarah's first days back in India. She has just kind of jettisoned her life as an itinerant journalist and decided to start working in tiger conservation. So here she is, she's on the ground, she's just met her colleagues, and they're taking her out before dawn one morning into the park, hoping that they'll get the opportunity to see a tiger. So here they are, they're in the Jeep. For 40 minutes, they waited in the biting air. Sanjay and Hari exchanged a few quiet words about Hari's children, then fell silent so as not to scare off the animals. The engine ticked intermittently as it cooled. Sarah thought the membranes inside her nose might freeze and shatter. For a time, she listened to the pressured pulsing in her ears to take her mind off her fingertips, burning with chill despite her gloves. A hoopoe stalked across the road, its headdress of black-tipped feathers swaying. Sanjay handed Sarah his copy of Birds of the Indian Subcontinent. As she read the field guide by the red beam of her penlight, something shifted in the atmosphere to her right. Without moving, she slid her eyes in that direction, and there he was, a tiger, standing alongside the Jeep. She could have reached out and touched him. In the gray half-light, his body blended into the forest like a ghost. He turned his head and looked right into her eyes. Then he stepped past her into the headlights, and Sanjay whispered, "Tiger, tiger, tiger," and the four of them rose to their feet. In the light, he was no ghost, but a big, glossy male, long and lean, close enough that Sarah could see the individual hairs in his fiery orange coat. His breath turned to smoke as it hit the air. Without taking her eyes off the animal, Sarah raised her camera. Something about the angle of the tiger's shoulder seemed eloquent, as if all his power and grace originated there. The backs of his black ears sported white spots that stared back like eyes, then disappeared as he flicked his ears backward to judge the Jeep's proximity. He had registered their presence, that much was clear, but he had already measured them up and decided they weren't worth bothering about. He sauntered down the middle of the track, unhurried but purposeful, stopping every few feet to spray his scent on a tree or bush. 20 feet past the Jeep, he reared up and placed his forepaws on a tree trunk, stretching easily 6 feet up. In profile, his eye glowed amber, as if lit from within. His tail swished the dust as he pulled his claws through the bark, which squealed and groaned under his mauling. Hari started the engine, and the tiger turned his head, his eyes transforming into an unearthly electric green. He pulled his black lips into a demonic snarl, wrinkling the skin of his nose and cheeks. His long canines gleamed. Then he dropped silently to all fours and disappeared into the trees. Sanjay turned to Sarah and grasped her hand in victory. "God is smiling on you," he said, and in fact, so was Sanjay himself. "That was Akbar, the resident male. To see him in your first hour in the park, it's unheard of." Later that morning, back in her apartment, she thought about that moment. God is smiling on you. People didn't usually talk to her that way, but she liked that Sanjay did.
I'm trying to put myself as a listener of this podcast, and I'm thinking, what are the 3 ways to disappear?
That is a great question. I like to think that every reader can answer that for themselves. Some people don't like to, to think that there isn't one. So I do have an answer, and that is that the 3 ways to disappear are physically, as in when a person dies or when an animal goes extinct. Emotionally, if you read the book, you see that Sarah and her sister in particular, as well as her mother, that there's an emotional distance between them that they're really struggling to bridge. And spiritually, our relationship with the natural world and with the ineffable is right there together. I don't think that there's a lot of distance between those two. And to me, the experience of being in nature and contemplating nature is an experience that leads very quickly to wonder. And you could call that spiritual. I think that's fair to do. And so those are the 3 ways.
I'm pleasantly surprised by your answer here, because I think I got so into the characters that I saw the three ways to disappear as relating directly to Marcus and Sarah and Quinn, to the point where I was wondering if the mother was almost a fourth way.
Interesting. When I speak with book clubs and people who've read the book, that's a question that often comes up. And I love hearing people's different interpretations of it. I do think you're right, Charlie, that the three siblings represent the three ways to disappear in certain ways. And that is probably the most literal interpretation of it. And it suffices. It definitely suffices. But I love the game of thinking of all the different ways that that idea can come up.
I found it unexpected, though by no means unwelcome, that you have this relationship, romance in the book with Sarah. Was that always important to include?
Not from the beginning. That was something I didn't know was going to happen until probably the second or third revision of the book. I didn't know it was going to happen, and then I didn't immediately know whom it would happen with. The romance grew out of, I think, as I was imagining Sarah in this setting. She's new to the country. She has a few people who are new to her, with whom she's working very closely about something that they are all very passionate about. And it seemed to me that that kind of passion and that kind of closeness and proximity could really spark into something. So that was really fun to write.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, obviously you did a lot of research, obviously in the book, and also you've explained it here in the episode. But, you are discussing a country and a culture that's different to your own.
Right.
And I noticed that through Sarah, you kind of note that there's a Westerner's privilege there. She's treated differently. She sees things differently. Was this something you were thinking of more personally at all when you were writing, like as a Westerner viewing this situation yourself?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I really struggled with it. I really didn't want to be, the Westerner kind of coming into this country that had been colonized and just come barging in and sort of see everything through my Western viewpoint and let that be that. And yet at the same time, there's the inescapable fact that I am a Westerner who came in and saw and experienced things through my own lens. There's no way around that. So I struggled with that a lot. I wanted to be respectful. I wanted to not make clumsy mistakes. And so eventually, before the book was published, I worked with an editor who was someone who had been born and raised in India and also was a writer herself. And we worked only on that question of, did I get it right? Did I screw things up? Were there things that I needed to be aware of that I wasn't aware of? So it wasn't kind of a general edit of the book. It was specifically about those questions. And it was wonderful. It was a very humbling experience because I got a lot of things wrong. And she was not at all hesitant in calling me out. And, if I'd done something that was really a big mistake, she did not hesitate to let me know. But I'm so glad that I did that because there were cultural issues that I had no idea I was making, whether it was just through assumptions or misinterpretations, misunderstandings. There were mistakes I was making, and I was, thank the universe, I was able to readdress those issues, and I think to a large extent to fix them and not to step in things nearly so much as I would have if I hadn't had her keen eye on the book.
Fantastic. On a completely general note here, what effect do you want your book to leave on readers once they've finished?
I want them to be in love with tigers. I want them to be in love with India. I hope that they might find themselves in love with the characters too. I came to love the world and the characters just personally. I don't want to say that the characters are my children because I think that's a little bit of how do I say that?
Bit too cute?
Yeah, maybe a bit too cute. Yeah, they're not my children, but I want readers to leave with a sense of appreciation for the wonders of the world, the natural world, and also the mysteries of human relationships and the fleeting nature of them, the way that we need to take advantage of the time that we have and the opportunity that we have I tend to view the world that way. I tend to think, how do I not squander the time and the opportunities that I have? And so I hope readers will leave asking themselves that same question.
Well, I know I started really being compelled by Sarah, but I'm going to take Quinn with me, definitely, I think. Not that Sarah isn't important by any means. I do kind of want to hug a tiger, which I'm not going to carry out.
That's a good choice. I too would love to hug a tiger, but yes, I think I won't try that.
Okay, so readers, I usually end this on what's next. Katy and me have had a discussion prior to the recording. All I can say is keep a lookout for Katy's work in future. It's coming. Keep a lookout there. Links to purchase 3 Ways to Disappear are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed this conversation, do subscribe to the podcast for future episodes. And as always, my email address is in the description as well. Katy, this has been wonderful having you here. Your book is fantastic, and I've learned so much more from you being here. And it's just been a lot of fun hearing everything. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, Charlie, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been a delight, and I've loved your questions. You've got me thinking about a few things I might have to go back and consider further. So it's been just a delight. Thank you so much.
The next interview will be on Monday, the 8th of February. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 30, was recorded on the 21st of January and published on the 25th of January 2021. Music and production by Charlie Place.